Life in the Trinity Ministry, in partnership with Brian McLaren, is pleased to present this series entitled The Storyline of the Bible.
I have a daughter named Jody who is a fantastic songwriter and guitar player and singer. Obviously, I'm her big fan, and in fact, tonight I'm going to go hear her sing in a coffee house not too far from here. I'm so thrilled to watch her develop as a musician because I love music, and I've been a songwriter and singer, terrible singer, but maybe a decent songwriter most of my adult life. Actually, when I was 14, I started playing guitar. I'd played some other instruments before that. I remember when I got a guitar, I started by playing other people's music. One of the first songs I learned was an old Glenn Campbell song that probably isn't even on the oldies stations anymore, called Gentle on My Mind. I used to play that for hours. I think I learned a Beatles song, Hey, You've Got to Hide Your Love Away. Anyhow, I learned a couple of songs back in the day. And eventually, though, I stopped just learning other people's songs, and I started writing a song of my own. And when I discovered the joys of songwriting, that became my real love and passion. And that's the way my daughter is. She just is a really talented songwriter. I've always been crazy about songwriters, David Wilcox, Bruce Cockburn, so many others. I love good singer-songwriters. We're in this podcast going through the biblical story. We're taking it in 7 major episodes. And today we're going to begin the 3rd episode. The first episode we're calling Creation. The second episode we're calling Crisis. But in the 3rd episode, it's as if the Jewish people start to sing their own song. They start to tell their own story. You see, I think the stories in the first 11 chapters of Genesis in many ways are recycling stories. The Jewish people take the stories of the nations around them and they make them their own. They sing them in their own style. They adapt them so that those stories now will make sense in the context of their belief in one true and living God who's the creator of everything. But it's very clear from scholarship of the ancient world. For example, there's a lot of stories from ancient Sumeria that really resonate with early stories in the first 11 chapters of Genesis. A lot of resonances with a work called the Enuma Elish and some of the stories of Gilgamesh, especially the story of Noah is so obviously related to a story of Utnapishtim, which is in ancient Sumerian literature. And some people think it's terrible to assume that the Jewish people were borrowing stories from others around them. I don't think that's terrible at all. I think it's fascinating, and it's exactly what we'd expect. And what is especially interesting is how they turn those stories for their own purpose. The differences between the maybe older Sumerian story and then the adapted Jewish, the recycled Jewish story, I think are truly fascinating. And I see us being able to learn so much about God and ourselves in that process. But when we get to chapter 12 of Genesis, it's as if the Jewish people now begin to sing their own song. Now they're telling a story that's uniquely theirs. And this story is remarkable. And it brings us to the 3rd episode in the biblical narrative. But before we look at that in more depth, one way to think about the first 11 chapters of Genesis, and again, this might bother some of you, but I don't mean to bother you. I just think I think it's beautiful, and I think this is being true to what's really there in the scriptures. It would be to say that human rebellion and human evil and sin and violence create a huge problem for God. Now I know in one sense, how can we talk about God having a problem? But just play with me for a minute here, because the first 11 chapters of Genesis present God as being very much in the thick of the story. It's almost as if God is a character in the story. And God has a number of ways of dealing with the problem of human evil. First, God threatens with death. If you eat of this tree, you will die on the day you eat of it. Well, they eat of it. So what is God going to do now? It's like the mother maybe who's frustrated with her kids, and she says, if you bang those pots and pans together one more time, I'm going to throw you out the window. Well, what are they going to do? They just think, that'd be interesting to see her try. Well, then she doesn't want to throw them out the window. And God doesn't want to destroy and make Adam and Eve die on the day that they eat of the fruit. So what does God do? Well, he does something other than what they expected. He doesn't make them die, but he does make them leave the garden. Now, I know we have ways of dealing with that we say, oh, they died spiritually, but that doesn't say that in the text. That to me is one of those ways of importing some extraneous material to I think, in some ways distort the text. Then what happens? He says, well, I'll make your life hard, and maybe that will keep you from doing too much evil. Well, he makes their life hard, but they still do evil. In fact, Cain kills Abel, even though he's got the hard life of being a farmer and bringing food through the sweat of his brow. So what does God do with Cain? Well, when he sees Cain getting angry, he warns him, but the warning doesn't work. Cain goes ahead and kills his brother. And so then he's afraid. And what does God say to Cain? Okay, then you're going to have to be a nomad, just like your brother was. You're going to have to be a wanderer, just like your brother was. But then Cain is afraid that means he'll be killed, just like he killed his brother. And so God, and now this is interesting, God protects the perpetrator of the crime by putting a mark on him so nobody will kill him. Then we get to the story of Noah's Ark, and how does God deal with evil? Well, he basically says, let's get rid of all the bad people, and we'll just keep a very small number of good people. And I meet people today who seem to think that's God's preferred way of doing things. But it's interesting. After doing that, God says, well, I'm never going to do that again. I'm never going to wipe out everybody again. And it makes sense that he would say this, because what does the good person do? As soon as God saves him, he goes and gets drunk. And all kinds of trouble results. So then we get to the story of the Tower of Babel. And how does God deal with human evil there? He just confuses everybody's language, and that way they can't ever work together again. It's like you've got your 3 kids arguing and fighting, so you send each of them to their room, and by separating them, then we won't have any trouble. And I think this might sound like a little bit of a playful way to read the first 11 chapters, but I'm just telling you that when I read it, this seems to me to be what's going on, and I would encourage you to read it and see what you think. You might disagree. But what's so interesting to me is when we get to chapter 12, now God has a different way of dealing with evil. And this is the way of dealing with evil that God stays with through the whole rest of the Bible. He never goes back to some of those previous ways of dealing with evil. Now, when the Jewish people get their own story, beginning with their primal ancestor, Abraham, now there's a new way of dealing with evil. We find this in Genesis chapter 12. The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you." Now this is interesting. Abram is part of what we would call the Sumerian Empire. And he's part of one of these huge amalgamations of power. And for God to start a new story with the Jewish people, Abram has to leave. He has to leave geographically, leave your country, and he has to leave his people, his ethnic identity, and even his family system. He's got to get away so there can be a fresh start. And, of course, we find out later, Abram has no idea where he's going, but he just leaves. And how did God speak to Abram? I don't know. Did he hear a voice? Did he have a vision? I don't know. But in some way, Abram knows he's got to leave, that God wants to do something new. And he'll find out where he's supposed to go once he starts on the journey. And then God says these words, and these words are in poetic form. And that suggests to me that these words are part of the oral tradition of the Jewish people that would go back very, very far. And these are, to me, are some of the most important words in the whole Bible. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. Now remember, he's just been told, leave your nation, and I'll make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. God is saying, I'm asking you to leave a very successful, dominant, powerful empire. But I'm going to do something new in you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. Now, interesting. In Hebrew poetry, it works very much with parallelism. I will make you into a great nation is parallel to I will make your name great. But then I will bless you is made parallel to you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Now, this is so interesting. One of my favorite theologians, the missiologist Lesslie Newbigin, used to say that the greatest heresy in the history of monotheism involves a misunderstanding of these words. Because remember, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all trace their spiritual lineage back to Abraham and back to this moment. And what Lesslie Newbigin says is that we misunderstand the calling of Abram. And that really is what our third episode is. We start with creation, and then we have crisis, and our third episode is calling. What we want to do is just take part of this calling. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great. Whoever curses you, I will curse. And we like that. Make us great and disadvantage everybody else. But in so doing, we leave out what is truly unique about the Jewish calling. It's not just that God will bless them. Everybody who believes in a God believes that that God will bless the people who are faithful to that God. But not everybody believes that part of the blessing from God is to become a blessing to other people. So, Lesslie Newbigin says, if we assume that God calls us for blessing, he says, then we're guilty of the greatest heresy in the history of monotheism. But if we understand that God calls us for blessing to be a blessing, that God doesn't bless us to the exclusion of everybody else, but God blesses us for the benefit of everybody else. He says if we understand that, we are getting the truly radical nature of God's call to Abraham. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you. So let's just think about this for a minute. How does God solve the problem of human evil? Threatens us with death? Well, God can threaten us with the worst punishments possible, and we'll still disobey. God could make our life very hard. But he does that, and we still do evil. God could warn us. He can warn us, but we still do evil. God could wipe all the bad people out and just save a few people who still seem pretty good. Well, as soon as you do that, the good people will do some bad things too. God could separate us all and just keep us away from each other, send us all to our own rooms so we speak our own language, so we don't even have to interact with each other. Maybe then that'll stop us from doing evil. No, that doesn't work either. What really works, and this to me is what happens in the first 12 chapters of Genesis, we go from creation through crisis to calling, is that God says, the way we'll deal with evil is I will work with some of you, and then you will bring that blessing to everyone else. An analogy I've thought of for this is, let's imagine some terrible epidemic starts spreading across the world. A lot of us have been worried about the bird flu or SARS or something like that. But some terribly contagious disease spreads across the world, and people everywhere are just sick, and they're in bed, and they can't even get up to go to work, and there's no medicine to treat this disease. Let's imagine that you are the person, you're a great chemist, and you invent a great, pathologist, microbiologist, and you create an agent that will bring healing for this disease. Let's say you invent a liquid, and all someone has to do is take 3 tablespoons of this liquid and they will start to feel better, and eventually they'll overcome the disease. Now, everybody's sick. What are you going to do? If you can't mass produce the cure because people are too sick to go to work, you've cooked it up in your kitchen, and you've got the recipe for it. What are you going to do? Well, let's say that what you do is you think of someone who you know to be an altruistic person, and you go to that person and you say, listen, I'm going to give you some medicine, and this medicine will help you get healthy. But the purpose for me in helping you get healthy is not so that you and I are healthy and everybody else dies. I'm going to ask you, as soon as you're healthy, here's the recipe for this medicine. Will you make up some of it, and will you start distributing it to other people? And when you distribute it to them, choose people who won't just be selfish and get healthy themselves, but choose people then who will use their health to bring health to others. And that seems to me to be the way that God has chosen to deal with the sickness of human evil. And so this passage, Genesis chapter 12, becomes incredibly pivotal in the whole story of the Bible. The story continues. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. And he took his wife Sarah, and they took everything they'd accumulated, and they traveled. And eventually they settled, and they stopped at a place called Shechem. And this is a place where Canaanites lived. Verse 7, the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So God didn't tell him where the land would be, but then tells him when he gets to that place. And so he builds an altar there to the Lord who's appeared to him. And he goes to another place and pitches his tent. And there he calls on the name of the Lord and worships the Lord. And so he gets land that God says, okay, I'm going to give you a home. But ultimately, the purpose of you having a home is so that that will be your base of operations, so that you can bring blessing to other people. Well, in this way, Abram is known as the father of the Jewish people. He's someone who believes not in many gods, but in one God, and he's a God who, the God that Abram believes in is a God who doesn't bless him to the exclusion of everybody else, but for the blessing of everybody else. Abram has a number of other encounters with the Lord. In chapter 15, God appears to him in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram. I'm your shield and your very great reward. And God, in this vision, makes his commitment very visible and palpable to Abram in a very powerful way that sounds strange to us, but was very meaningful in the ancient world. And eventually God gives him the covenant of circumcision so that there is a sign of being part of this unique people who are blessed to be a blessing to everyone else. But of course, as you know, Abram is very old, Sarah is very old, and time passes and they still don't have any children. And this whole promise depends on him becoming a great nation, which means having a lot of descendants. And so when it seems that Abram is way too old and Sarah is way too old, Abram has faith that the promise will come true. And the promise does come true. So we have a promise made to Abram. He has, and the promise is preceded by a call to go on a journey, even though you don't know where it's leading. And the promise requires you to keep faith, even though it seems completely impossible that your faith will be rewarded. And that's the story that begins the story of the Jewish people as they begin to sing their own song, as they begin to know their own identity. Well, eventually, Abram has a son, Isaac, and Isaac encounters God as well, and the promise continues. And Isaac has a son, Jacob, and Jacob has many powerful encounters with God. And God repeats to him that this same primal promise that I will bless you and you will be a blessing to other people. And so now the momentum is building. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And of course, eventually Jacob has a son named Joseph, and Joseph also is a man who learns to follow and live with the living God. And in fact, as we saw in our previous podcast, at the very end of the book of Genesis, Joseph, who's been mistreated by his brothers, becomes a blessing to his brothers. And because of his great integrity, he becomes a blessing to all the people of Egypt. And now we start to see God at work in history, the God of creation, who stays faithful to us during crisis, who then calls us to join God in bringing healing and blessing to this world. It's a beautiful story. I wrote a book called The Story We Find Ourselves In, and I think that really is what we're dealing with here. It's the story we find ourselves in. And I think there's something deep inside of us. We could sing a lot of other people's songs, but eventually we come to realize that this song, to be blessed, not to the exclusion of everybody else, but for the benefit of everybody else, that's our song. And each of us is going to learn to sing that song in our own way. This is Brian McLaren with Wired Parish.
You've been listening to Brian McLaren. To visit Brian online, go to wiredparish.com.